From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Donald Trump visits hurricane-ravaged North Carolina with a pledge to supply more funding and to overhaul FEMA.
An executive order to begin the process of fundamentally reforming and overhauling FEMA, or maybe getting rid of FEMA.
We'll have more with former North Carolina Congresswoman Kathy Manning, with Trump now set to land in Los Angeles this hour to see the damage from wildfires while suggesting conditions on aid for California.
Plus, as Trump says he'd rather not put tariffs on China, we'll look at the role potential levies play in his overall economic and tax policy with former House Ways and Means Committee Chair Kevin Brady, now with the Alliance for Competitive Taxation. Thanks for joining us on this Friday, wrapping what has been an incredibly fast-moving week in American politics, and of course, the newly minted 47th president of the United States ending his week with a bit of travel to disaster zones.
Yeah, first trip outside of Washington since the swearing in on Monday. We had to remind ourselves we're still in the same week here. First stop in North Carolina. On his way to California, as we mentioned, Kaylee, not only disparaging FEMA along the way, but suggesting a new idea for conditions to aid in California.
Yeah, we may hear more about that when he lands later on this hour. But what we already have heard much about is just how disappointed he's been with FEMA. Let's listen.
FEMA has been a very big disappointment. They cost a tremendous amount of money. It's very bureaucratic, and it's very slow. Other than that, we're very happy with them. Okay, and I think when there's a problem with the state, I think that problem should be taken care of by the state.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. Not sure exactly what his vision is for emergency preparedness in the future, but is this the end of FEMA as we know it?
Maybe today he just wanted to say that because North Carolinians are indeed frustrated, as many disaster victims are with FEMA. It is a big, slow bureaucracy. But it didn't start being that way under Joe Biden. As we recall, George W. Bush had to deal with them with Katrina when he said, heck of a job, Brownie, not meaning it, apparently. And all these other disasters, it's always been slow, and it takes a long time to get your insurance paid and things like that. And that's very frustrating when you're the victim of a disaster. The trouble is putting it on states may actually give Congress some pause because they would have to approve any dismantling of a federal agency. And, their states are the ones that have these disasters. Some states can better afford that than others, and some of those states on the Gulf Coast, for example, that are not Florida, might have trouble getting through a disaster if they had to fund it themselves. So we really don't know what's going to happen.
Well, and it just becomes a question of if all states are seen as equal, not just when it comes to potential emergency management, but also for federal emergency aid. As Donald Trump is saying, for California, you don't just get that for free. You got to agree to do certain things. Potentially, he suggested today, voter ID laws.
Right. So, today, first of all, he wanted the water to somehow get from Northern California to Southern California, as if, yes, there's a valve and there's a pipeline. There is no pipeline. There is no valve, right? The water is in Northern California. There was water in Southern California, but it also hasn't rained there since April, and the water doesn't move. But more importantly than that, to what you were saying, Kaylee, is that when asked today in North Carolina if he would put any conditions on the aid for North Carolina, this was moments after someone pointed out how big his victory margin was in North Carolina. He just talked about how badly they had suffered and things like that, and he didn't really answer the question. Then he talks about California aid and says not only does this water have to be moved somehow, they have to approve voter ID, which is states run elections. It is their prerogative. And to condition federal aid on state laws on elections is unusual.
Well, before he ever left, the idea was floated of tying it to the debt ceiling.
Yeah,
so
right.
It would be, very difficult for Democrats and even some Republicans to vote against it. Are we normalizing conditions on emergency aid now? Is this kind of part of the new reality in Washington?
Well, at least for the next 4 years, it sounds like it will be. I mean, tying it to the debt ceiling is kind of something Congress will always try to do, is sweeten the deal for one side and sweeten the deal for the other. Obviously, Democrats are going to want that California funding to go through. Yeah. And the debt ceiling is negotiable. But tying it to aid, we'll see if this actually happens. A lot of the things that Trump says he's going to do, he says it to satisfy his base, and then it doesn't really happen, and then the base doesn't know it didn't happen. So it's, so he still gets the win without shattering a norm. But he may. Again, it's the first week. We don't know.
Yeah. And Speaker Johnson seems to be on board with conditioning aid as well.
Yes.
So it also becomes a question of congressional leadership. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much. And speaking of Congress, the Senate is expected to vote this evening on the confirmation of Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense over the objections of at least 2 Republican senators. President Trump discussed Hegseth's prospects earlier today.
He's a good man. I don't know what's going to happen. You never know in those things, but Pete's a very, very good man. I hope he makes it. I was very surprised that Collins and Murkowski would do that.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis, who covers the Senate for us. So as he just alluded to, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, 2 Republican senators already have said their no votes. It would take 2 more to sink Hegseth. What are the prospects of that really happening tonight?
It would be unusual. I mean, the last time we saw people vote for cloture and then kill something the president wanted was John McCain with that big thumbs down 8 years ago on the Affordable Care Act repeal. There are people we're watching, people like Mitch McConnell, who is sort of stone-faced in the hallways these days. I mean, I keep asking him, and he keeps telling me, I still don't like doing hallway interviews. I think he's one to watch. We're always interested in Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who faces re-election. He's probably target number 1 for the Democrats next year. And, he's got to walk a fine line between supporting Trump and supporting things that are going to be popular in 2 years in a general election. And Collins and Murkowski, they can vote no because they're in different situations. Collins needs crossover voters in a Democratic state next year. Murkowski wins with Democratic and independent votes in Alaska. She's been primaried before and won as a write-in. Yeah. So with Murkowski, I think she feels like she wants some of these votes that aren't definitive, aren't killing. She won't get credit for killing somebody. Yeah. So I would be surprised if he goes down, but surprises happen.
It's been suggested that if he does go down tonight, that actually helps Tulsi Gabbard next week. If he's confirmed tonight, Tulsi Gabbard becomes the next target. Is that true?
I think Tulsi Gabbard has problems of her own. I've talked to Republican senators on the Intelligence Committee who are not convinced that she is up for the job yet. They want to hear a better explanation of her visit with Bashar Assad in 2017 in Syria, some of her spouting of Russian talking points, her questioning of the intelligence community. She has been an ally of Tucker Carlson, who is an enemy of Mitch McConnell. You can quickly see how you can get to multiple members of the committee. Susan Collins is on the committee. Todd Young's on the committee. Neither of them have endorsed her yet and have concerns. So you can see how she could die in committee. You could also see how she could get to 4 votes against her.
We just have 30 seconds left here, Steve, but RFK Jr. and Kash Patel also are facing committees next week. Are they going to have as tough a time?
I think both of them are under a lot of pressure to show that they're up for the job. I mean, they haven't run this kind of an agency before, and they have bipartisan questioning, especially Kash Patel and the January 6th thing after the pardons. Does that affect votes? And then RFK, his vaccine denialism or vaccine skepticism, whatever you want to call it. Mitch McConnell got polio before the vaccine. He is very strong on vaccines, and certainly the Democrats as well. So I think he's got a lot of work to do.
Next week is going to be a doozy. With the help of Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis, we will find the truth. Thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us. Coming up, we go to ground in North Carolina following Donald Trump's visit to Asheville today. We'll be joined by Kathy Manning, former Democratic Congresswoman from North Carolina. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We've come to North Carolina with a simple message for all the people of this region who are hit so hard by Hurricane Helene, and that message is very simple. You are not forgotten any longer. Today, here I am to deliver on that promise, and we have a lot of things in mind, and we're getting the Army Corps of Engineers all set. You need your riverbanks fixed. You need a lot of roads fixed, and we're going to get it done in rapid time.
President Trump today in Asheville, North Carolina, delivering a message to residents who were directly impacted by Hurricane Helene. Joining us now, someone who has been through quite a lot since the hurricanes passed. Kathy Manning, former Democratic Congresswoman from North Carolina, joining us from Greensboro. Congresswoman, welcome. It's good to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. We heard a lot today from Donald Trump. Said that FEMA was responsible for the suffering of people in North Carolina, and he essentially blamed that on Joe Biden, suggesting that the Biden administration abandoned the people of your state. Is that true?
No, that's ridiculous. I can tell you, because I was involved in almost weekly calls with FEMA from shortly after Hurricane Helene, that FEMA was working full strength, coordinating with the state agencies, state emergency responders, the Army Corps of Engineers, which you just mentioned, or which I guess he mentioned, had been in Western North Carolina. And in fact, I know that the Army Corps of Engineers actually built a well for one of the hospitals so that they could have the water they needed to take care of patients while the water and sewer systems had been knocked out by the storm. So FEMA was working extensively at full force. We know that FEMA has actually provided more than $316 million in cash grants to individuals. FEMA has 11 disaster relief centers opened in North Carolina, and they have served more than 60,000 individuals. Now, in a disaster like this, and this was an unprecedented disaster, people need all the help they can get. Western North Carolina had never experienced anything like this previously. So I am delighted that President Trump has decided to focus on North Carolina, because North Carolina needs as much help as it can get. But slamming FEMA is inappropriate, because FEMA has been working and coordinating with our local agencies and in fact, the Army Corps of Engineers and military who have been loaned to Western North Carolina.
Well, it's not just, Congresswoman, that he's speaking unfavorably, shall we say, about FEMA. He's suggesting he wants it dismantled entirely and that it should be left up to the states for emergency response. Would a state like North Carolina have the resources or manpower to respond to a situation like this on its own in the future?
I don't believe so. I don't believe the American people at this time where we are having increasing disasters. I don't think the American people elected Donald Trump to make it more difficult for individuals and states to get the relief they need during disasters. I think people need as much help as they can get during these disasters. I thought it was interesting. He didn't have a plan of what he would do instead of FEMA. He didn't have a plan for how to help states that weren't able to handle the disasters. He's just interested in cost cutting, and I don't think that's what people are focused on right now.
Well, tell us what is needed, Congresswoman. We saw Donald Trump today with some affected families who clearly have been through hell, standing in front of an RV in a house that has been so badly damaged they can't live there any longer. What does North Carolina need now?
There were thousands of people who had to leave their homes, and FEMA and the local agencies were able to put people in temporary housing, were able to put people up in hotels, were able to bring in mobile homes to help people. But the devastation, as you can see on the pictures that you're showing, the devastation was just extraordinary, beyond what anybody could expect. I know that there have been I think 3 million cubic yards of debris that have been cleared and removed, but there's so much more. I went to Asheville area several months ago to see what had happened to that wonderful city, and whole areas had been destroyed. They had a new arts district that had just been finished, an incredible renovation that was totally destroyed. There's a wonderful area of Asheville, Biltmore Village, that where all the stores and restaurants had been destroyed. And this was right at their peak tourist season. So there is much more aid needed, not just to get people back in their homes, kids back in schools, businesses open so that they can start the recovery and people can start running their businesses again. There's much that's needed. Getting rid of FEMA is not the way to do it. If we need to improve FEMA, great. Pull together a task force of prior successful FEMA administrators. Let them take a look at what has been going on and see if there are ways to improve FEMA and get relief out faster. But destroying it, disbanding it, doesn't seem to be the right way to go.
We also have questions, Congresswoman, about what's going to happen with aid in California, as there has been suggestion by the president, by the Speaker of the House, that any emergency aid should be conditioned. Do you believe any of your former colleagues in the Democratic caucus would vote for any conditions on emergency aid for any state?
I can't imagine that. And in fact, I saw a quote from one of my close friends on the other side of the aisle, Representative Young Kim, who is a Republican, and said she thought it was wrong to condition aid because her constituents need relief. The fires have been absolutely devastating. The most important thing is not to make any of this provision of relief political, not to use it for political purposes. And in fact, right after Hurricane Helene, there was so much misinformation spread by then candidate Trump that FEMA actually had to put a myths and facts section up on their website so that people didn't believe the myths that were being spread and were willing to go get the help they needed.
Yeah, we read a lot of those on the air at the time. You know, it's interesting. You've been there. I realize it's not your charge now, but as a member of Congress, surely you were faced with moments like this. The idea as well is coupling disaster aid with raising the debt ceiling. How does a Democrat vote against that?
Vote against raising the debt ceiling? I think that
coupled with emergency aid, yes, conditioning aid, the way Kayleigh was talking about. It might not just be voter ID in California. If it's attached to a bill to hike the debt ceiling, lawmakers have their backs against the wall here, no?
I see what you're saying. Using it as a weapon. Look, this administration talks about weaponizing government, talks about the prior administration, but actually, I think what we're seeing is Donald Trump is using every effort to weaponize this government for his own political purposes. He is trying to put Democrats in a tough decision. The Speaker of the House has already demonstrated his ability to throw out their votes that specifically put Democrats between a rock and a hard place. And we're going to see that happening more and more during this next term. And I just hope that the Speaker puts the people of this country ahead of his own political motivations.
All right, Kathy Manning, former Democratic Congresswoman from North Carolina, thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, an executive order from President Trump targets, quote, illegal DEI policies, but it lacks clear definitions and criteria, causing confusion for corporate America. We'll bring you that story next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Companies are really looking at what's important to them and their culture and their values. There will be some risks that these organizations may be facing by really doubling down on their efforts for DEI, but it's part of their bottom line. They're seeing results from that, and they want to reflect their customers.
This is Amy Dufresne, founder, CEO of HR Standards Institute, talking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power today. Talking about some of the different approaches that companies are now taking to shifting DEI policies. Remembering Monday, President Trump signed an executive order ending DEI programs across the federal government. The offices were closed Wednesday night, putting thousands of workers on paid leave and causing new uncertainty throughout the private sector. Here with more, Bloomberg's Simone Foxman, who's writing about this reverberation in the private sector today on the terminal. Simone, it's great to have you. What does this mean for government contractors, for instance, or any private entity that has a DEI program.
You know, it's interesting. This really began on Monday night, but there was a second order on Tuesday night that has caused much more confusion than the initial statements about anti-DEI. And the federal contractor impact is significant because this impacts some of the country's largest companies, Amazon, Boeing, and beyond. So essentially the order says that the companies that are federal contractors have to affirm that they don't have, quote, illegal DEI discrimination policies. And they have to actually affirm that. And then the federal agencies are meant to go out and promote getting rid of DEI diversity policies at these companies. But really, executives don't know what that means. No company right now really believes that its policies are out of line with the law. Frankly, a lot of them have done a lot of rethinking, especially since the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in June 2023 about making sure that they're doing stuff by the book. So they really don't understand exactly what the administration wants them to do. Both critics and supporters of this new order, though, say that, frankly, the confusion is the point.
So is everybody just kind of sitting on their hands for now until they get further direction, Simone, or are people taking action already to try their best to comply?
Yeah, I mean, corporate leaders are frantically calling their lawyers saying, what should we do? We'll probably see some of them changing some of the names of existing programs, whether they are, structured hiring programs or things that, have fallen under the DEI banner, but don't necessarily relate to, racial equity or social justice initiatives, and maybe moving them somewhere else, calling them something different. We do expect to ask the question, does DEI, the acronym, still exist in 6 months? That's not something I've gotten a straight answer on. But frankly, everyone right now is just very concerned. They're also concerned about a part of the second order that tasks federal agencies with identifying potential violators, up to 9 of them, publicly traded companies, large foundations, universities that they believe are violating civil rights by having DEI programs. But there's no sense of what those criteria are. So there's a lot of calls to the lawyers. There's a lot of folks really just not sure what to do and trying to skate through without calling attention from Trump and others.
All right, Bloomberg, Simone, Foxman, great reporting. Thank you so much. Coming up, as House Republicans get ready to talk taxes at their conference meeting in Florida on Monday, which Donald Trump himself will be attending, we'll look at their plans with Kevin Brady, his former House Ways and Means Committee chair, now spokesman for the Alliance for Competitive Taxation. And he's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
To further unleash our economy, our majorities in the House and Senate, which we also took along with the presidency, are going to pass the largest tax cut in American history, including massive tax cuts for workers and family, and big tax cuts for domestic producers and manufacturers. And we're working with the Democrats on getting an extension of the original Trump tax cuts.
President Trump speaking virtually at the World Economic Forum in Davos yesterday about his plans to extend and expand tax cuts. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Kevin Brady, former Republican congressman from Texas, former chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and now spokesman for the Alliance for Competitive Taxation. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Sir, you, of course, have joined us for months now on this program, beating the drum about the need to renew the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Donald Trump was doing the same on the campaign trail, and it's kind of go time now. They have the House and Senate. He has the presidency. How quickly can this happen?
So, I think as quickly as they can pull everyone together with a near zero majority, that's a degree of difficulty more than what we had in 2017. The good news is I think they've been meeting. President Trump and the House and Senate Republicans and tax writers, have been preparing for this for several years, but they really got out of the gate fast with conversations right after the election. They're continuing those conversations. It feels like almost daily, and they'll be meeting with the president down through Republican retreat early next week. So Speaker Johnson has set a very aggressive timetable to get this on the House floor in mid-February, and to move from there. I think I love these aggressive timetables because President Trump did the same during tax reform. It helped us reach consensus quicker. And again, with such a narrow majority in the House, all this will be a challenge. They will get it done, no doubt. I'm confident of that. But yeah, they've set an aggressive timetable for a very slim majority.
An aggressive timetable and a couple of extra layers here, Congressman. I don't know what sounds scarier, by the way, a near zero majority, the way you put it, or a majority of one. But that's the reality that we're in here. And on the campaign trail, many other ideas were introduced, from no tax on tips the president will be talking about this weekend in Las Vegas, to so many other components when it comes to overtime and the rest that we've talked about here on the program. Our listeners and viewers should know you helped to write that 2017 tax bill. Will you recognize it when it's done this time?
I think great question. And I think the answer is yes. The bulk of what they're trying to make permanent is really the core, along with that really dynamic corporate rate that leapfrogged us competitively, that drove wages up so high. Yes, I think that will stay in place. I think they're looking for ways to improve upon that as well in the competitiveness and the innovation type areas. But I think they've already begun discussions on how you accommodate the president's priorities, such as taxes and overtime, Social Security. I'm really confident that they'll find common ground on SALT, but they'll have to figure out with these new proposals, what is a good design regarding tips and overtime. What can they afford? How do they reach that common ground with the president? It's pretty natural conversation, and the good news is I think they're already running a number of options for the president to consider.
Well, on SALT specifically, sir, we spoke with Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York on this show yesterday, actually the early edition of Balance of Power. He is fighting hard for the SALT cap to be lifted. This is what he told us. We'll have you respond.
If we do nothing, if we pass no tax bill, SALT comes back unlimited, which I would support. But the problem is that it would be associated with the largest tax increase in American history. We have to negotiate in good faith. It's incumbent on everybody to do that. We are working through the numbers right now with the Ways and Means Committee to come up with a number that actually will provide real tax relief to middle-class families.
The problem, sir, is that he's not willing to put a number on that number, nor are his other colleagues who are fighting the SALT battle. So SALT battle, rather. Could you do that for us? What number do you think ultimately is appropriate that everyone is going to be able to get on board with?
So the bottom line, and I think there's a good one. I agree with him that everyone needs to negotiate in good faith, and I feel like they are. These discussions have been going on for quite some time. Secondly, I think he's reluctant to, and so would Chairman Smith, because they're in these conversations, just as we had in 2017 when we agreed to restore $10,000 limit, which was double the standard deduction, average SALT deduction at the time. I think the challenge here for all parties is, one, this is very expensive to lift that SALT cap. We used the SALT dollars that went primarily to the wealthy for middle-class tax cuts and the small business tax cuts. So everything you add back, gets taken from somewhere else. So obviously that's a conversation. The other part of it is that so much of the SALT cap goes to, in fact, the bulk of it goes to homes making over $1 million a year. That's not really where Republicans are at for providing those tax cuts. And so that's why I think, he's being cautious about putting a number to it, because they're in the conversations on how do they achieve everyone's goals in this negotiation.
Of course, also conversations about tariffs underway right now at the White House, and that changes the nuances of our conversation. On the early edition of Balance of Power, we talked about that, Congressman, with Sarah Bianchi, the former deputy U.S. Trade Representative under the Biden administration. From her view, here's what she said about what she saw as the difficulty of counting tariffs towards revenue. Let's listen.
The hard facts of numbers are a real challenge for this president. And the other challenge that they have is lots of the tariff stuff they can do through executive order. But our Congressional Budget Office and our budgeteers don't count that as revenue when it's done that way. And so they're trying to find a way to get credit for that money.
How do you look at this, Kevin Brady? The White House would tell you, Scott Bessent would tell you can't have one without the other. The Trump tax cuts will be covered in part by the tariffs. You're an old-style Republican, where tariffs used to be a bad word. And I wonder if you look at these tax cuts and the idea of revenue and compartmentalize that away from tariffs. Is this all one picture for you, or are they separate?
So, as you know, I'm not an advocate for tariffs for a number of reasons. Economically, the fact that it drives up prices invites retaliation against our Made in America companies. There's just a lot of challenges with it. I think everyone agrees with the Treasury Secretary, soon to be, and the President that we want to challenge unfair trade practices, and we want to anchor critical manufacturing supply chains in the U.S. and running through our reliable trade partners. Tariffs, though, can be an unreliable source of revenue over time. Nonetheless, I think what Republicans in the White House are discussing right now is when the president moves forward with his executive orders on tariffs or imposes them according to current law, can that revenue be counted in some way toward offsetting those tax cuts? And I think they're doing the same as they look at what new revenue from growth from energy, lower energy and more abundant energy, and other economic growth, deregulation, just rebalancing regulation. That's been a real drag on the U.S. economy. And then how extending and improving on the tax cuts can grow the economy even more, because right now we've seen record levels of corporate revenue as a result. Even with a big rate cut for corporations, they're sending more to Washington than they ever have before because of growth. So I think it can be captured in a broader sense. And I think they're having the conversations on how best to do that.
Got it. Kevin Brady, in a beautiful evening in Texas. Look at that sunset. Looks great, Congressman. Come see us in Washington. You might be a little bit chilly next time you get here. It's the former Republican congressman from Texas, now spokesman for the Alliance for Competitive Taxation. We thank you as always. Coming up, we'll look at President Trump's visits today to North Carolina and Southern California. He's still on the road. And our signature panels next. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
California, we want them to have voter ID so the people have a voice, because right now the people don't have a voice because you don't know who's voting, and it's very corrupt. And we also want them to release the water. If they released the water, they wouldn't have had a problem. If they released the water when I told them to, because I told them to do it 7 years ago, if they would have done it, you wouldn't have had the problem that you had. You might not have even had a fire.
President Trump today in Asheville, North Carolina, saying that he wants the California disaster aid to voter ID laws, wants to tie them together. But it's the idea of water being restricted from L.A. that we talk about with our signature panel as he continues his travel from North Carolina to California later today. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. He is Republican strategist at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, of course, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So here we are. We made it to Friday. Thank you so much to both of you for being here. To think that we were together on Monday, that was only 5 days ago. I know I keep saying it. Donald Trump said it 7 years ago, turn the valve. He told Gavin Newsom, let the water flow, as if this were a scene out of Chinatown. How come there's no water?
Well, the governor says that is incorrect and not true. And, I think, the reality is that the people of Los Angeles in that area have experienced a horrific, horrific disaster. And what they need from their state government and their federal government is a concerted response that is not based on whether they are a red or a blue state. And so while I appreciate that the president is going there, and I think he's absolutely right to go to these 2 disaster zones today, what was troubling to me was to hear him say, how many of you voted for me? And oh, yeah, there's going to be conditions on aid for California that have nothing to do with fire policy, the environment, but no conditions on North Carolina because it's a red state. So I think he is absolutely right to go there. They do deserve his attention and they deserve help. And that's what we do in the United States.
Well, so when we consider this prospect of aid, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it when the president actually touches down at LAX, Rick, it's not just him that is saying this. The Speaker of the House is as well. We've spoken with Republican lawmakers on this program all week who have said it's not that bad to tie conditions to aid or tie it to the debt ceiling, what have you. Do you think this really happens?
You know, it's hard to tell. I think that at the end of the day, the administration will probably try to do the right thing in the sense that they're not withholding aid right now, and there's a lot of money being poured into California to fight the fires, and a lot of the equipment and things like that are federally sponsored. So, you know, the question is going to be probably more related to the rebuild than the current effort to try and stem the flow of these fires, or increase the flow of the water. I do think, you know, everybody should be reminded that California for decades have been under all kinds of pressures around drought. In fact, 20% of the state is under an extreme drought today as we speak. And so I trust that the people and the experts in California, if there is water to use in an effective manner, whether for agriculture or urban use, they're going to do what's in the best interests of California. So, I mean, I think, you know, this idea that we're blaming fires on something, let's get the fires out, let's secure the public, make sure everyone's safe, and then start thinking about what we do, because the rebuild in that region of L.A. is going to be massive, tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's where the federal aid will probably likely really become a sticking point.
Well, the idea of federal response being challenged today, of course, by Donald Trump, as we established on the early edition of Balance of Power. We talked about that with Gina McCarthy, the former White House National Climate Advisor, used to run the EPA, her reaction to Donald Trump's plans for FEMA.
I have to say that after listening to some of the remarks by the president, I'm not sure I'd feel better and more confident about the federal government jumping in and making sure when we see climate disasters like this, we aren't running towards folks, making sure that they can get the safety and security that they need. So my hope is that over time, the president will learn that FEMA is a great agency.
Is that going to happen at some point? If he says he fixed FEMA, this is the agency that we wanted, or this is the end of FEMA as we know it? States like California might have the resources to fend for itself, not so much in every state across the country.
Yeah, first of all, I heard your interview with Gina McCarthy. We were just talking about it offset. I thought it was so insightful and so important because we don't hear enough today about the connection between these disasters and climate change, and that's something that she speaks so eloquently about. You know, I think Democrats have to be very careful here politically. President Trump is right when he says the bureaucracy is slow, cumbersome. FEMA can be improved, but it is a big cry between reforming and completely abolishing, which is what they talked about in Project 2025. He said he wasn't going to follow Project 2025, right. And here we are again. So I do think that we have to wait and see what he says he's going to do. Improve, absolutely. We can all improve, but completely disband. Even a state as big and strong and powerful as California, no state has the resources to help its people when they are hit by a disaster, as Rick said, in the billions and billions of dollars.
So, Rick, can you think of any governor, especially the ones that often find themselves having to respond to natural disasters, saying, yeah, leave us alone, we'll be fine?
Yeah, no, not at all. Look, the federal government has more resources than anybody else. That's just a plain, simple fact. And when they can bring them to bear on things like, you know, Hurricane Helene or these fires, they can do more than any one state can possibly do. And it's not just about money. It's equipment and people and manpower. And you can't have all those things replicated in 50 states waiting for a disaster to occur, right? Talk about inefficiency. So there is a unique role for the federal government. But that being said, FEMA probably could use reform. I mean, there's no question that these agencies need to have a fresh look at how they manage their resources and whether they're getting good taxpayer dollars. Good outcome for the buck. And so I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't be looking at FEMA and saying, can they do a better job? But at the same time, realize there's a unique federal role in helping support these communities that are ravaged by these kinds of storms.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will be sticking with us as we look ahead to cabinet confirmation votes and hearings to come next week. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A confirmation vote is expected tonight for Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth. In fact, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, you see a live shot of the Senate floor where Senator Adam Schiff, the Democrat from California, is currently discussing Hegseth's nomination. Debate on this is expected to end within the next few hours. A vote could come at 9 p.m. Eastern time. And this is before we get into a boatload of other confirmation hearings to come in the Senate next week. So for more on this, we turn back to our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Rick, Hegseth, we already know 2 Republicans are going to say no. Is there a risk that 2 more join this tonight, Mitch McConnell or Tom Tillis, and sink him?
Well, the president was forecasting Mitch McConnell today when he was doing a presser in North Carolina that, I thought he was a no vote, right? I mean, no, he actually voted for the process to go forward, but that doesn't guarantee an outcome, tonight when they vote on the floor for passage. And so I think that Mitch McConnell, I mean, he is the smartest Senate strategist still today, and I think if he votes no, that means there's somebody else in the wings vote no too, and that means that the nomination doesn't survive a floor vote. So I think if Mitch McConnell doesn't vote, it means there was no 4th vote.
How about that? That would be a big deal, of course. As we look at the lineup for next week here, Jeannie, it's been suggested that if Pete Hegseth is cleared tonight, that makes life even more difficult for Tulsi Gabbard if Democrats want one scalp.
Yeah, and that seems to be the thinking is that, you can only have one to say no to. Historically, if you get to the hearing and you get to that point, you're going to get through. So if Pete Hegseth didn't survive, that would be a historic loss for the president. And as it stands, even if he survives, it's going to be a very small margin, the smallest for a defense secretary. Tulsi Gabbard, I think she's the one that people feel like, given her positions, given her stances, I've even heard people suggest that her discussions with some senators weren't as positive as some others may have wanted, that those things may sink her nomination. So it's going to be fascinating to see. And I tell you, Kash Patel, I am waiting for them to talk about his children's book, which I am fascinated by. Oh,
he's going to sell a lot of books maybe next week.
I recommend everybody read this thing if you want to see what's in store for us.
We're going to need like a triple split screen for next Thursday.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a doozy with RFK Jr. as well. I just wonder if they're also going to have like a big prop printout of the enemies list or something like that.
Count on it. Yes.
Yeah.
That's the drama we're
There's so much to look forward to next week. But before we get to next work week, we got to talk about Sunday as well. Obviously, this is a Washington-oriented show, but I think a lot of people across the country are invested in this. The Washington Commanders, Rick, up against the Eagles on Sunday. Haven't seen anything like this in like 30 years. You think they can pull it off?
Look, these are the cardiac kids, right? I mean, and the one thing we know for sure is everyone's going to be watching till the last second of this game because they went 5 games in a row winning in the last seconds. So I think it's going to be a brawl. It's the Amtrak series we've all been waiting for some time. And go Commanders.
Jeannie, I don't picture you watching this football game. If we're softening things up here, the other big pastime in Washington right now be the pandas.
Yeah.
2 new pandas at the National Zoo. Panda diplomacy. Where do you fall on this?
I I love the pandas.
Football or pandas this weekend?
Oh, football all the
Look
way.
Look, we got the panda cam is back up. That just happened.
What about if they put a little hat from the Commanders on the panda?
Commanda Panda.
Wow.
That was very good, Kaylee.
That's very good.
I can't be the only one saying that in the district.
Take it to the bank. Let's
Just like the two greatest things that have happened to D.C. in a long time.
Yeah, it's been a while. We're exhausted.
This.
We'll take what we can get. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you. The watch party starts at what, 3 o'clock Sunday?
3 o'clock's kickoff.
Unless you're tailgating with Rick Davis. Many thanks to our signature panel. Go Commanders. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. In the meantime, you can find something on the pandas there on the terminal and online.
And you can find us back for more next week. So thanks for joining us on Balance of Power in what has been a historic week in Washington and in national history, frankly. We're glad to have you doing it all with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio.